Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Peter Slezkine, the director of the Russia program at the Stimson Center, to discuss some of the important responsibilities that the US, Russia, and China has as the three world's great powers in terms of ensuring stability as well as peace in the world. So welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you recently published an article in the prestigious magazine Foreign Affairs. The title was The Fatal Flaw in the Transatlantic Alliance, in which you argue that the transatlantic security partnership between the United States and Europe has, to a large extent, outlived its purpose and needs adjustments. And indeed, in today's security environment, it can often even undermine U.S. security. I was wondering if you could flesh out your argument, because Washington seems to be pursuing these ideas as it seeks to pivot away from Europe. However, if I understand your argument correctly, you don't think incremental adjustments will be sufficient. So I guess what are the flawed premises of the Transatlantic Alliance?
Well, first, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-author, Jennifer Kavanaugh, who wrote the piece with me, and make it clear that I am speaking only for myself as I explain the argument of the article. I guess it might seem like I'm pushing on an open door, given Washington's policies, Trump's preferences, but in fact, I think I'm quite a bit more radical in my understanding of the transatlantic relationship. There are quite a few in the what's called the restraint realist camp. And I'd like to note that I'm a historian, not a realist. So I don't quite belong, but sort of ideologically I fit within that category. So there are a lot of people in this grouping in Washington who think that the transatlantic relationship has problems, but that most of them originate in the early 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the assumption is that there used to be a bipolar balance that made sense, that created more or less sort of global stability. And that once those balance disappeared, the United States lost all sense of limits and ended up doing all sorts of silly things. I actually think that US policy post-Cold War is just an extension of the existing logic. And I think that that is pretty easy to demonstrate given where we ended up. That after a period of triumphalism, then a desperate attempt to find a new enemy and all sorts of useless misadventures in the Middle East, we ended up under the Biden administration with a foreign policy that was explicitly founded on a global opposition between the so-called liberal order and the autocracies represented primarily by Russia and China, the old Cold War foes. So basically the structure, the framework of U.S. foreign policy had not changed at all. So I think everything went wrong, not in 1991, but in 1949 or 1950. And the argument in the essay is that there were three basic problems associated with the origins of the transatlantic relationship. The first is the pivot to Europe, which I don't think was, strictly speaking, necessary and came at the cost of attention to the Western Hemisphere, which used to be a U.S. priority. And the sort of situation that we're in now with migration, drugs, cartels in Mexico, bad relations with Cuba and Venezuela are a product of this pivot in the middle of the 20th century. And I think it's also important to sort of investigate the pivot to Europe and the Cold War that resulted from it, because there are now calls to pivot to Asia, the new richest region in the world, which I think would repeat some of the same mistakes, or at least lead to some of the same problems. The second issue with the original transatlantic relationship was the militarization of this transatlantic alliance. That the original American impulse was economic reconstruction in Europe. which was assumed to be sort of geopolitically beneficial, but also economically. But ultimately, European economic integration became a European project separate from the US that resulted in the European Union. And the Europeans desperately desired a military alliance with the US at the head. And that is, interestingly, the only institution that actually binds Europe to the US. And sort of for the core of the world's greatest empire to be only military is not necessary. Britain had a Commonwealth, for example. And now we see that there is a desire to transition this relationship to more of an economic basis. And I think that's overdue. And finally, the transatlantic relationship is by definition regional, but immediately, already by 1950, it was embedded in a universalist ideological framework. NATO and the transatlantic relationship were just part of a larger free world foreign policy, and the free world itself was defined negatively as the non-communist world. So the West, within that larger framing, lost any sort of positive sense of itself. And we see where that is headed also with the liberal order, the current state of the West, that it's entirely unclear what the West is, what the liberal order is, other than sort of a rejection of Russian aggression.
Yeah, this what the West is. It seems like we're going through a bit of an identity crisis, which was also evident when J.D. Vance came to that security meeting in Munich back in February. And I thought this was interesting. The Europeans were quite upset that he would criticize his own, that is, the political West or the Europeans. However, they didn't really specify where he was wrong, though, in terms of Europe kind of losing its way and also becoming more authoritarian. But I did find that the argument to be interesting, though, what you refer to as, well, not just you, but the liberal universalism. Because this is also a key component in Europe, it seems, because for the Europeans, being so many countries, to find a unity or common position, there's a tendency to frame all policies in ideologies. So if all policies are framed as values, that is good versus bad or moral versus immoral, this can go from EU enlargement to warfare. Then effectively what we're saying is that some policies are moral and dissent is immoral. So it becomes a very a way of boxing ourselves in. But I thought it was interesting what your perspectives on the what's referred to as the free world. Why is this a problematic concept for you? Not just you. Why is it a problematic concept? Sorry.
Well, it's particularly problematic for me. I'm writing a book on the origins and impact of the idea of the free world. So I've been focusing on its problems for a while. But I think it's problematic not just because it's a highly moral category and a crudely simplistic moral category, but because it's both universal and negative. So it's one thing to base policy on moral judgments or values. Everyone does that one way or another. Realism is a way to describe the world, but it's certainly not a way for societies to exist among others. But when you reduce policy to an opposition, a global opposition between two blocks, and then define yours in opposition to the other, then you have a problem. So the free world was the non-communist world. It wasn't the West. It wasn't democracies. It wasn't capitalism. It was defined explicitly as the non-communist world. So it had a very clear geography. You could look at the map and define exactly where its borders were. On the other hand, it was totally unclear what the free world shared, other than the absence of communism. And this led to all sorts of problems in American policy. It necessitated a global policy of negative containment, because once you decide that you lead the entire free world, then if the slave world intrudes anywhere, you need to react. So Atchison, in conversation with people from the Pentagon, had defined an American defense perimeter that excluded Korea. But then the North Koreans move a few inches south. The free world must be defended. And off we go. It doesn't matter what the strategic priorities might have been. And this is repeated over and over and over again. One could argue all the way through Ukraine. Nobody wanted to defend Ukraine when they were just the military men were looking at the map. But as soon as sort of the autocratic access, the slave world makes an advance, the free world must respond. And again, I think that this more or less describes American Western policy from Korea through Ukraine. Also, American policymakers were scratching their heads about how to create ideological cohesion from the very start. They were terribly frustrated that the communists seemed to have a coherent message, that they knew what to say, and that it was all wrong, but nonetheless, there was something coherent that they could explain to others about their own purpose and identity. And the West had no such thing. And they kept searching from the late 40s all the way to the collapse of the communist bloc for some unifying message. And obviously could never find it because there is nothing that ties the Argentinians to the Indonesians other than the absence of communism. And the failure to find a common faith then necessitated an exaggerated focus on a presumed existential external threat, because the only source of internal cohesion was the axiom that there was some force outside which is so menacing and so aggressive that unless we all rally to oppose it, we will all be subsumed by it. And again, you can see that all the way up to the present day, or maybe pre-Trump, with the emphasis on China and Russia and how they were bent on doing nothing but destroying the liberal order. And the liberal order was whatever Russia and China wanted to destroy.
So, in your view, though, how should ideology or this whole idea of liberal democracy versus authoritarian fit into U.S. strategy, or do you don't think it should have any role at all?
I think there are various possibilities for some kind of positive purpose, and they should probably be mapped onto realist, pragmatic underpinnings. So if the idea, and I think this is what I would prefer, is to unify the entire West as a large bloc that can compete in a world of behemoths, then you have to figure out what the West means. And the problem is that the West has dissolved itself within the free world and liberal order. The Western canon has been excised from university curricula. Christendom no longer really exists. So it's not an easy task to explain what the West is. It's much easier to revert to nation-based politics because that is how our states function. We vote for our leaders who are supposed to represent our interests. So that is the clear alternative to liberal universalism. So that is one way to give obvious positive purpose to your policy, is that each country should represent its own national interest in the international system. Again, I think that probably is short of what we need, especially if you're in Europe. Norway for the Norwegians sounds good, but if Norway is on its own, it's far too small to matter, and is going to be somebody's tail being wagged around. So I think that the first order of business is to define the West not as it has been since the Cold War, basically a bloc opposing Russian aggression, which is all a mirage now anyway, but a giant sort of trade and tech bloc that needs to cohere as a whole in order to compete with China, but not in the military plane, but more in sort of the technology trade dimension. And that then maybe some kind of ideological coherence would come after the West had cohered sort of politically in that fashion and recognized itself as a separate entity and not the building block of a limitless liberal order.
I think it's very relevant, as you said, to the current crisis we have, this block thinking. Because if we don't have a common or clear conception of who we are, besides from who we're opposing, then you end up in this very us versus them block politics, where threat inflation is always a key problem. Now, you kind of see this with the war now in Ukraine, because originally the Russian security demands weren't really that unreasonable. That is, in terms of not wanting a hostile military bloc on their borders with the accompanying military infrastructure. But instead we now have this incredible threat inflation where Putin is Hitler. Russia doesn't just want to destroy Europe; it wants to destroy Ukraine, but also conquer Europe. That is, it's going to march on Poland, and why not go on Paris next? I mean, it's quite absurd. But behind all this extreme rhetoric, we also see the same assumption that if we don't face this immense all-encompassing Russian threat now, then America will leave Europe. So it is it is the idea that if we don't hype up the Russian threat, the West as we know it will begin to dissolve, and anyone who challenges this becomes a threat. So Trump, for example, is a massive threat because he wants, even back in 2016 and 17, we said, getting along with Russia is not a bad thing. This became a challenge to the core of the West because, well, what are we if we're not opposed to Russia, China, and the rest? I guess the point I'm getting to is that back in 2014, Henry Kissinger made a point that he was quite worried exactly about this rhetoric, that we were now talking about defeating Russia. And he was making the point that if we do recognize Russia to be a great power, then the objective should be to harmonize core interests. Now, harmonization doesn't mean that they have to be the same, but it's the ability for what is different to coexist. But how do you see a path forward for this? Because we kind of strayed very far away from these ideas. Now we're openly talking about the need to strategically defeat Russia. It's the long-range strike into Russia. Why not put NATO troops? I mean, in Europe, it seems like we're ready for war now. How do you how can America, I guess, dial this back? Because on this continent, people are more or less losing their minds.
Yeah, I mean, there have been many wise men, Kissinger and Kennan among them, who have warned against this outcome and have proposed fairly obvious seeming alternatives. The problem is that for as long as the West existed essentially as the liberal order, the free world, confrontation, I think, was probably inescapable. There's no reason for conflict if you just, again, look at the map and relative threat levels. But if you think of the European Union, NATO, the liberal order, as something that must ultimately be universal, then the fact that it can't swallow Russia, that there are parts of Russia's neighborhood which ultimately are off limits, that is destructive of the entire underpinning ideology. That is why it was impossible to shut NATO's open door, right? It seems like what could have been easier than to just say, nobody wants Ukraine in NATO, we're not taking Ukraine in NATO, no need for a war. But they couldn't say those words because in some sense, that was antithetical to the entire project. And when you hear these Europeans, like you say, have lost their minds, talking about how Russia is an existential threat, it sounds ludicrous because there obviously aren't going to be any Russian tanks in Berlin or Paris, let alone London. And I forget who it was recently saying in Britain that, like, unless they tighten their belts, they're going to have to all learn Russian. I mean, it sounds insane. But I think they're right, these liberal elites, that their version of Europe is under mortal threat. That once it becomes clear that the world actually is divided into different political areas, that spheres of influence exist, that there are limits to liberalism, then their political order falls apart. And so when you ask what we should do, I think the US is already trying to pull out of this. The problem is that Trump came in imagining that he could just extend a hand of friendship to Putin, ask him politely to stop, and that would be the end of it. But as far as the Russians are concerned, any American promise is difficult to trust because Trump might be transitory, and he's unpredictable, and then who knows what comes next. And Ukraine is obviously a strategically crucial issue right on their border. So the Americans believed that Russia might exchange sort of a return to the fold, that if the U.S. offered for Russia to come in from the cold, that would be enough for Russia to give up its sort of minor peripheral interest in Ukraine. Whereas, as you know, for Russia, these are not minor peripheral interests, but absolutely core strategic interests. So I think that the biggest stumbling block is Europe, and we may need to wait either for European exhaustion or for a change of elites, which seems probably inevitable. The question is whether it will come soon enough.
But Trump, he, on more than one occasion, he referenced NATO expansion as the cause of the war in Ukraine. But over the past few months, he doesn't seem to have been able to utter those words that NATO will not expand further, given that this is the foundational cause behind the war. It is quite extraordinary. Do you link this then to his still commitment to open door, that he can't, the open door policy, that he can't challenge it? Because when he does the negotiation now, he treats it as if he has to make the Russians and Ukrainians come to an agreement. But NATO is America, like the Europeans are, a minor sidekick here. So, this is within his control to take this main obstacle off the table, but we're not really seeing it being done. Well, did you see him also then being committed to this liberal internationalism and NATO-centric order? Because he seems quite not unwilling. He takes some steps away from NATO in many ways, but why do you think he's not taking this path?
Well, one, I think, mistake that Trump makes is that he's in some regard a realist in his own particular way, or sort of he treats every state as its own corporation, and believes that they are all, they're differently sized, but they're all interchangeable in that respect. So he treats India and Germany according to the same logic, not realizing that Germany is part of the American empire and India is not. And so I think this is why you end up with this American approach where the U.S. or Trump positions himself as a mediator between Russia and the West, or Russia and Ukraine, which is obviously not the position it actually occupies. And he believes that he can use a combination of carrots and sticks on both parties. So first of all, that fails to acknowledge that Russia is winning the war. So it needs a reason to stop. This isn't a symmetrical affair, but also that Russia is outside of the American system. So the U.S. can create certain conditions within which Russia will have to exist. It can exert pain, but it cannot directly influence decision-making. Russia can suffer considerably more economic hardship. Missiles could even hit Moscow, but then it's up to Putin and the population how to respond. They can decide that this is too much and that they want to stop, or they could escalate. Whereas Germany or Ukraine essentially have to take commands from Washington, commands that Washington so far has been reticent to give, because there's been a lot of back and forth, even though it's clear ultimately that Trump doesn't like this war. He's called it a stupid war. It would never have happened if he'd been in power. He is not terribly committed to NATO. He certainly is no fan of the liberal order and doesn't see any reason to, expand the EU and NATO all the way to Kazakhstan. But nonetheless, he doesn't seem to understand or want to just sort of exert obvious control over his own imperial appendages. And that would, I think, help all parties if he was just a little bit clear about who he could control.
Yeah, well, I like that from your article. The clarity is is really present. That's why I'm wondering if the Trump administration would call the Stimson Center tomorrow and ask for what should be the new transatlantic order, because you don't want any small tinkering or incremental changes. You want to have a proper I guess a rebalancing of America's relationship with Europe. What exactly would this entail? How would you see the ideal relationship between the United States and Europe?
So first of all, I do think that there are people in the administration who sympathize with this argument, who are already pushing in this direction. It's just, this is kind of a revolutionary moment, a changing of paradigms, not to mention the fact that the man at the top is a powerful, charismatic figure in his own right. So it's difficult to chart a perfect path at this point. But so my argument, to make it clear that it's not entirely just a critique of where we are, is that the West actually could reorient itself fairly easily if it just thought of itself in different terms. That there is no reason for the United States, Portugal, France, etc., to be part of a bloc that is based entirely on opposition to Russia. There is no Russian threat to any of those places. And even on Russia's immediate borders, the threat is manageable enough that if, like, the Balts and the Scandinavians, perhaps the Germans, certainly the Poles, were to take care of it themselves with some American aid in areas that they can't manage on their own, it'd be more than sufficient. But it wouldn't have to serve as the purpose for the entire bloc. But if the West were to just acknowledge itself as the West, and this, I think, was more or less the Vance's message in Munich, that the biggest threat isn't China or Russia, but immigration. That is a way of saying that you guys have to realize who you are first. And once you do, if you do, then we can all be in the boat together. Europe should reindustrialize, become strong, and that then would be the basis of our common purpose going forward, is create internal strength within a bloc that is bound by sort of history and culture and identity, and that then within the larger world, the West would be more than competitive.
Yeah, there's this argument that ever since, we can say, the French Revolution, or the foundation of US, we had this development of liberal nation states, where you had this internal contradiction, though, that it doesn't have to be contradiction, that the liberalism and conservatism balanced each other. So the nation state is based on, again, a common history, language, culture, tradition, religion. You can have all of this, and based on this platform, we have liberal ideals, so carve out some room for the individual. It just seems over the past few decades, liberalism divorced itself from the nation state, and now we identify solely based on ambiguous references to what should be liberal ideals, but these tend to change as well. I mean, you can say that Europe these days is only committed to liberalism, not the nation state, but in that process, liberalism itself seems to be taking on a very strange, nastier form. So your view then is more to develop a more civilizational West, based on more conservative ideals, and I guess sustained with more economic and technological sovereignty, or is that more or less the path?
Yeah, I mean, I think the civilizational aspect is necessary just to provide some kind of ideological coherence. And as I said before, it will be difficult to recreate given how much of it has already been lost through, obviously, just demographic change, but also just a shifting in identity from one based on nation, religion, civilization to one based on these kind of liberal premises. Lowest common denominator globalism, where the Westerners have to kind of dissolve themselves or self-efface in order to fit in. But I think if there is a construction of a geopolitical West an economic West, a technological bloc that corresponds to the West. And if that is more or less successful, then the cultural, civilizational aspect could return and help reinforce this bloc. So I think the nation state would be less important in this construction. It would have to be geopolitical. It would have to be sort of like a imperial commonwealth kind of structure. And it would have much more national content than the current liberal order, because the current liberal order has to absolutely destroy national identity in order to function. Whereas this larger imperial civilizational construct could absolutely tolerate national identities at a smaller scale within itself. But those would have to cohere within this larger amalgamation. So it wouldn't be mutually exclusive or competitive national identities. I think if the US pulls back, that is probably Europe's future, is a fragmentation back into jealous competitive nation states, which, given the size of other states in the system now, would reduce them to total irrelevance.
Well, it seems that some of this liberal post-nationalism or globalists, that they are on their back leg, though, because they're, sorry, back foot, because you have, well, a lot of the European leaders, be it Starmer or Macron or Merz, they're hardly popular, and it seems as if they're doing, their very best, abandoning all democratic pretenses to hold back the floodgates of, the discontent, seeking a correction, which would be more, I guess, in the direction that you're pointing to. But so I guess, you could see some light at the end of the tunnel, or I'm not sure if you're sharing my optimism there.
Well, I agree that on one hand, these liberal elites in Europe are still powerful, dictating policy in a totally pathological manner. On the other hand, they are illegitimate. The Starmer, Macron, Merz have, I don't know, the record low approval ratings. So if elections come soon enough, then Europe can pivot 180 degrees overnight. I think if any of those major countries flips, then all the rest will, and the entire continent will turn and regain sanity. But these guys are still in power. They are aware of their low levels of support, to put it mildly, and that unfortunately incentivizes ever more outrageous and escalatory behavior, because they see the whole thing slipping away. So they have to resort to this notion of constant emergency, never-ending crisis in Ukraine, the Russia threat that could result in aggression that engulfs the entire continent. I mean, the more desperate they get, the more sort of exaggerated the line becomes, the more likely they are to try to stir things up in a last-ditch attempt to prevent the sort of almost inevitable downfall of their project and their own personal political prospects.
When I introduced you, I should have added that you're also the host of the Stimson Center's Trialogue Podcast, where, well, you then look at the relationship between the United States, Russia, and China, because, well, as these great powers have a special responsibility in terms of managing cooperation and competition. If you can get those three big players, organized, then it's easy for the rest to fall in place. But given that you see the transatlantic relationship having is on the completely wrong track and should be changed fundamentally, how do you see then the relationship between United States, Russia, and China? Should it be based on the UN Charter, or do you go back to like a concert of Europe? How do you, well, concert of nations, I guess, but how would you see the foundation of this relationship?
I
How should
would go
this
back to the middle of the
well,
20th.
sorry.
Yeah, I would go back to the middle of the 20th century, but not to the United Nations. Instead, to the four policemen idea that Roosevelt espoused at one moment. I think the United Nations we might as well keep around for now, but that it's essentially useless. That it's a product of a different period. That its composition, its rules reflect a different moment, and reform at the scale necessary would be essentially impossible. So leave it, but certainly don't base any new world order on top of it. But I do think that a multipolar sphere of influence for policemen approach, and policemen, obviously, given the idea of the American global policeman, doesn't sound very attractive. But if the assumption essentially is that these large powers, civilizational centers, bear primary responsibility for their regions, then I think that that is a very useful framework. And so, again, like a bigger West could orient itself toward competition with China. I mean, China would set the benchmark. Who can produce AI that would be at the forefront of technology that would be adopted by most people in the world? Do we have competitive industry? Do we have sufficient resources in order to continue to be at the forefront of technology and to provide for ourselves? But that doesn't mean that it would require direct confrontation. The old model obviously did. You had a dividing line between the free world and the communist world, and wherever that line threatened to move, a clash, a war immediately broke out, and it was essentially zero-sum. So I don't think that we can necessarily enter China's win-win world, global harmony, this and that, but a world of responsible great powers managing their own regions and each aiming to maximize their own power does not necessarily result in sort of a, I don't know, law of the jungle battle royale. Because I think there's also just a limit to how far these entities would want to go. Because if you are focused on maximizing your own power internally, then there's a clear cost to expansion, to trying to meddle in the affairs of the others far from your own power base.
Well, historically, though, the United States, whenever it went to war, it would seek to join wars, like in the two world wars later, when the different parties had exhausted itself, and the main objective was not to seek a complete victory of one, but rather it should leave balance of power behind. So because the main concern would be if too much power would be concentrated in one actor, then it could pose a threat to the United States. And then after posing this balance of power, pull a bit back, because otherwise the physical presence of the United States would then incentivize a collective balancing. Now, this seems to have been part of the thought process of Eisenhower as well, because he puts this idea that if we're not out of Europe within a decade, we have failed. So again, this fell within the traditions of the United States, but that thinking not being followed, we kind of see that it played out as one could have expected. If the US has excessive presence on the Eurasian continent, we see that the larger powers are finding common cause in terms of collectively balancing the US. So the US is exhausting its resources and bringing large powers together, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, but if it's in opposition to the United States, obviously that's not positive. So under the Biden administration, we saw then definitely, due to the proxy war in Ukraine, that Russia and China were pushed together. But now also you can put Iran in that category. And I wouldn't put India yet, because they would like to improve relations with the US. But some of this seems to have been severely mismanaged as well, at least to the extent that India is willing to go a few steps further in the partnership to balance the United States, mostly economically, but or not mostly, they're not going security against the United States, but nonetheless, they see common challenges or threats from the US. What is the solution to this? I mean, again, one doesn't have to split these powers, but you don't want to see them working explicitly to counter the United States.
Well, I think the solution is just to abandon liberal universalism, the idea that the history should end, the world should reflect sort of American values from the North Pole to the South. And again, given those assumptions, you end up inevitably in a zero-sum bifurcated globe where everything that is not swallowed by that liberal monster becomes the monster in its own right. And then you have conflict along the entire periphery. So I don't think the presence of the United States in Asia or Europe necessarily provokes the sort of balancing that we see now. It's the constant advance in those areas. I mean, in Europe, the US, the Western Bloc, was pushing up all the way into Ukraine. Where are the confrontations currently underway or possibly on the horizon? Taiwan, the South China Sea, and Ukraine. So the US is pushing up right against its two adversaries and creating adversaries in a sort of larger bloc. In the result, it's pushing from all sides, and it's not a surprise that it has molded sort of an imposing force. So I do think that if it just circumscribes a Western bloc and also makes clear that its presence in Asia is limited to existing positions, and even perhaps retreats a little bit from the most forward positions, then the tension with Russia and China would decrease. It's also possible that the US might just retreat to the Western Hemisphere. And I do think that the current administration is pursuing two paths at the same time. On one hand, it is offering the West membership in this reformatted bloc, but it's kind of issuing a challenge. It's not saying that we're going to drag you into this. If you persist in fruitless conflict with Russia, green policies, immigration that deindustrialize and tear the fabric of your societies, if you are a useless asset, we'll leave you behind. And meanwhile, we're going to reinforce our positions in the Northern Hemisphere all the way to the Panama Canal. And that is obviously going, I wouldn't say poorly, but who knows how that's working. A war in Venezuela wouldn't help. But I do think that the US is in a position where it could abandon Europe. So the stakes are much higher for Europe, and not because Russia might conquer it or Putin is Hitler, but because the US might decide that Europe is useless and leave it to its own devices. And then it's totally unclear what will become of Europe, because I don't believe for a second in European strategic autonomy, because these countries are too equally sized, the powerful ones, to decide on a common security framework. Somebody basically needs to whip them into shape.
Yeah, that's United States. Well, the US, for all the tensions in the relationship, the US had always a pacifying effect, though, since all the way since World War II. I mean, this idea of Europe working together, it's not it's not a historical given, something one can rely on. And indeed,
Well, it certainly never happened,
no,
except under the embrace of Uncle Sam.
very much so. Well, if one would like to, well, I guess whip the Europeans into, back into common sense, abandon some of the crazy militarism, and at the moment they're willing to throw away, it seems, their own societies, in this dream to defeat Russia. But also there's a separate problem, the ability of the United States to improve bilateral relations with Russia, which is also a condition to restore some, I guess, balance of power across the Eurasian continent. It all depends on resolving the Ukraine war, and that's kind of my last question. Is is how this can be done. Because at the moment we hear, again, I'm not sure if it's an empty talk by Trump, but we're hearing now talks about sending the Tomahawks, which would then dramatically escalate tensions between the United States and Russia. But also the Europeans, they keep, every time they see a drone near an airport, they can conclude that it's always Russia, even though they later on find out it's not. And as we all check for Russians under our beds before we go to sleep, we tend to, whip up the hysteria even more and more. So resolving the Ukraine war is very critical here. So how do you have any good solutions to it in terms from the position of the United States? What can it do again if Trump comes knocking on your door?
So I agree that Ukraine is the major obstacle to the necessary adjustments. But I don't think that means that we need to begin by solving the Ukraine problem. That has been the issue up to this point, is this hyper focus on Ukraine, this desperate attempt to resolve the Ukrainian issue as quickly as possible, and then address the bigger structural issues. I think it should be done in reverse, that the United States should seek to reformat the transatlantic relationship and reestablish minimal constructive relations with Russia. And that would then allow for an opening to resolve the Ukrainian problem. Because again, it's not enough for the US to just come in and say, we want the Ukraine war to stop. Russia has certain minimal strategic objectives that it needs to meet. And for the first however many months of the Trump administration, that's been one of the big problems. And this sort of mismatch of timelines. And I think now the US more or less understands that this is going to take time, but there's still a frustration and impatience, and these threats of providing Tomahawks are a reflection of that, an attempt to accelerate matters by exerting pressure. So I think, especially if the Gaza peace holds, that gives Trump a major victory and should allow him to lower the salience of the Ukrainian issue. I think it would help tremendously if we all just stopped talking about Ukraine. I mean, in Europe, nobody's going to stop talking about Ukraine, but Trump can stop talking about Ukraine and just allow it to the conflict to continue for a little while and for a battlefield balance to emerge. Because right now, the conversation about Ukraine and any sort of ideas about resolution of that conflict are proceeding on a political meta level. Like who's on whose team, what is the principle at stake, whereas we should perhaps turn our attention elsewhere and then come back and actually see what's happening on the battlefield. What is the true balance of power? And then make a deal accordingly. And meanwhile, signal clearly to the Europeans that, again, if you want to be part of this bloc and the alternative is bad, like fragmentation or an attempt to create European autonomy, which is essentially impossible, or to throw your lot in with the Chinese or some alternative, that we are now focusing on other issues, that Russia is not the single unifying force anymore. Then go ahead and reestablish old consular relations with Russia. Send ExxonMobil to the Arctic. Sell billions of dollars of Boeing to Russia. Nobody else wants to buy Boeing. Russia does. Together with the Japanese and South Koreans, re-enter the Russian automotive market. That would demonstrate clearly to the Europeans that the national interest pragmatic approach is real, because now it's mostly rhetorical. And the Latvians, the Poles come to Washington, deliver a different message and get just enough of a response that they feel like it is possible to pivot the United States back to the previous status quo. So I think, again, the Trump adjustment to the American policy is in some sense clear, but it hasn't become concrete enough for the Europeans to be convinced that there is no alternative but to adjust to it. So I think if steps were taken in that direction, the Europeans, even the Macrons and Merzes of the world, would be forced to adapt. And that would change the context within which the Ukrainian conflict is perceived and make the sort of obvious endgame more realizable.
Okay, so to summarize then, the political West should learn and remind itself who it is and stop this excessive dependence on confronting this Russian boogeyman, which is centuries old plague we've had on this continent. But yeah, well, where can people find you? Because I find your work to be quite fascinating.
Well, thanks. The essay that we discussed at the top is in Foreign Affairs, called The Fundamental, Fatal Flaw, even though there are many flaws. I outlined 3, but the fatal flaw was the headline they chose of the transatlantic relationship or something along those lines. And then the Trialogue Podcast. So I would love your audience to look that up. I interview Russians, Chinese, and other members of the non-West to try to penetrate the Beltway bubble and get my colleagues to understand that there's a little bit more to the world than the liberal Western war.
Okay, so again, in these times where we're trying to transition away from the bipolar Cold War and the unipolar world, it's a great resource. So thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you.